Hello and welcome to lecture video number 1 for our week on genre, conventions, iconography, hybridity, experimentation, and intertextuality for Humanities 1900, OCC, winter semester, introduction to film. So I wanted to start off this video by talking about a concept that you're probably already familiar with to some degree, which is genre. Now, genre is a really kind of commonly used word, so most people have a kind of a sense of what it already means. If I asked you, what's your favorite genre of music, or what's your least favorite genre of film, you would have a sense of what I'm asking. The term genre meaning type is how it's most commonly used. But I wanted to think a little bit more deeply about how genre works specifically in film and how the conventions and iconography tied to a particular genre set up audience expectations in a particular way. So I want to talk about genre, which you might already be familiar with, but I'm also going to be throwing some new terms at you that relate to genre, but that maybe you're not as familiar with yet, right? So I wanted to start this video by thinking about categories of film, thinking about genres and subgenres as kind of subcategories of film, thinking about what genre is and how we can use it. And then in my next video, I'm going to think a little bit more about specific conventions in iconography, which are sort of the evidence that you can use to show that something is a particular genre. So let's start by looking at broad categories of film, right? So when I say broad categories of film, I mean a larger umbrella than genre. Genre is one way to categorize film, but there's a broader categorization method right here. These are 3 different forms that film takes: narrative film, documentary film, and experimental film. And most films are going to fall into one of those categories. So a narrative film is focused on telling a fictional story. This would include even films that say they're, quote, based on a true story or a biography or something like that. They're still focused on telling a fictional story or a fictional recreation of something that's already happened or that's actually happened. Documentaries are a little bit different than narrative because even though they also tell stories, they're constructing or reconstructing a version of reality using footage from reality, right? So narrative and documentary are both interested in storytelling in a particular way. The difference is that one uses footage that reconstructs a version of reality, the other fictionalizes and recreates in a different way. Now, experimental is often non-narrative, which means it's not focused on issues of character development, plot, moving from point A to point B to tell you a story. Experimental film, a lot of times, is focused more on kind of feelings or ideas, and it doesn't necessarily have a clearly linear cause and effect relationship like a narrative film or a documentary film might have. So it exists outside of the parameters of what we would traditionally consider narrative, right? So experimental film is not beholden to telling a story in a particular way. It's experimenting with the film form to do something other than just tell a story. Now, when you take those broad categories of film, narrative, documentary, experimental, you can break those down into further smaller categories, and that's when you start to get genres, right? Most of the genres I'll be using as examples in this video are examples of genres in narrative film. Now, documentary has its own different genres, different types of documentaries. True crime, for example, is a very specific type of documentary. Experimental films have their own little genres, but narrative film, the majority of the films we've watched so far this semester have been narrative films, are going to comprise the majority of the examples I'm going to give today, right? So what is a genre? Now, it's probably a word, like I said, you're already familiar with. It's a French term that means kind or type, but it's not just about how you categorize, what label you put on a film. Where do you shelve it, right? If we're going really old school, we think about, like going into a video rental store, a Blockbuster, or a Family Video. Where did they shelve it, right? Or at the library or wherever. What category is it under on Netflix or Hulu, right? So genre has to do with categorizing things, with putting labels on them, but it's not just about putting a label on it. It also refers to what audiences expect and how we create hypotheses about a particular type of film. Now, hypothesis creation is essentially when you are watching a film and you develop kind of a hypothesis or an idea about what you think is going to happen next. Now, we do this when we watch films all the time, even if you don't want to. It's really hard to turn off that part of your brain that's wondering what's going to happen next. So hypothesis creation is related to what you expect to happen, and what you expect to happen is based on what you're used to, which is based on genre, right? The way that we understand what's happening in a film, what's going to happen in a film, the way we make predictions is all based on the films that we've seen before that we can relate this particular example to. How do we categorize this? We know that if we're watching a romantic comedy, we can expect certain things to happen. Do those things always happen? Are our hypotheses always correct? No, but we can have a good sense of what's going to happen next based on genre. Now, the way that genres develop is pretty informally. There's no kind of head honcho in Hollywood that decides this is a new genre, this is what we're doing now, we're gonna call it the rom-com, right? That's not really how genre works. They develop informally through shared social understandings of types of film. Genres are social. They come down to how we watch and talk about and understand films societally amongst each other, right? New designations for genres and subgenres can come from all sorts of different people. They can come from filmmakers themselves, from people who work in the film industry, maybe producers or executives. They can come from critics and reviewers, viewers, audiences, contribute to the formation of genres. When we talk about films to our friends, when we post online, when you write a movie review for your personal blog, you're contributing to the idea of what a genre is, right? So a lot of times when the name of a genre is developed, it's a reviewer or a critic or some kind of random person on Twitter has decided that the rom-com is now a thing, zombie romantic comedy. And they kind of, as a one-off joke, post rom-com, and then people like it. They think that's a fun title for a subgenre and they pick it up and run with it, right? So the way that specific genres are named and formed has a lot to do with how we collectively view film, how we think about film together. Now, subgenres are devised to allow for more precise descriptions of film. So if the big category is narrative, documentary, and experimental, you go down one level, you get a little bit more specific, you get genres. You get genres like maybe horror and comedy and romance and melodrama and Western and war, right? Different kind of categories. But then if you go down one level deeper, you get subgenres. So let's just say you're looking at horror films, for example. You might get paranormal horror films. You might get horror comedies. You might get slasher horrors, right? You're going to get all sorts of different types of subgenres, and those subgenres, that level below, allows you to be more specific. When you just say it's a horror film, that's not very specific. We know that it's a film that's intended to scare the audience, but there's a wide range of horror films, right? There are creature features, big bug movies, slasher movies, paranormal movies, exorcism movies, right? All sorts of different types of horror films. So if you tell me, oh, I watched a horror film, oh, I watched a slasher film, I have a different understanding of the film that you watched, right? Based on genre versus subgenre. Another thing to remember here is that not all genres fit nicely into categories, right? A lot of films defy kind of genre categories because they do lots of different things at the same time, right? So they might have elements of science fiction and elements of horror and elements of comedy. And like, okay, well, which label do we pick? Maybe you pick a bunch of different labels, right? Maybe you just say this is really hard to label. The point of genre isn't necessarily to put something in a box, right? To say this film is this thing, that's it, case closed, right? Genre is evolving and adapting, and we can totally argue about genre. We can say, well, I don't really think it's that much of a horror film. I actually think it's this, right? It's not a science, it's an art, right? So when you think of genre, I want you to think about kind of a loosely defined category that's developed socially over time, but it's constantly in flux and evolving rather than static. Andrew Milner, film critic, says genre is not just a system of classification, but a set of practical conventions combining a mix of prohibitions, recommendations, and prescriptions, which together constitute a cultural technology for the production and reception of certain kinds of text. Now, to break that down, genre is not a system of classification, right? How we classify or categorize something, but it's a set of conventions. Conventions meaning kind of standard practices that prohibit some things, that recommend some things, and that prescribe some things. And when you put all those things together, it's a way to understand how texts are created and how we receive them, how we understand them. The important thing here is that genre is not a top-down process. Genre is done at the level of filmmaking, but it's also done at the level of film watching. When we watch a film, we are understanding genre. When you make a film, you are creating something within a set of genre expectations. But it's not just top down or bottom up, it's both directions, right? So genre is something that is done, it's something that we see, it's something that we understand, we kind of meet in the middle, right? Filmmakers create genres, we understand genres and discuss genres, and then we sort of meet somewhere in the middle. Now, thinking about how genre works on a historical level, the term itself actually predates cinema. Genre was a term being used before film and cinema were even a thing. Now, film critics only started seriously talking about genre in the 1960s, even though film has existed since the late 1800s. But it was used by the film industry to categorize and market films from the early days of studio filmmaking. So genre has existed for a long time. It was used to refer to different types of theater, different types of novels, different types of writing. For example, in early filmmaking, once you start to develop film studios that actually put out product and sell it, the film industry was using different types of genres to market films very early on. They had a sense of, this is this type of film, we're going to sell it to this type of person, they will like that type of film. But on an audience level, on a critic level, film critics and theorists did not start really thinking about why genre matters until pretty late in the game. Film had already existed for like 80 years before film critics started to worry about genre and what it meant, right? So that's interesting to think about. Historically, why did it take film critics so long to think about genre, even though the industry was using genre as a marketing tool before that? So film genres became established by borrowing and adapting existing conventions and rules from other types of media. So a lot of film genres that exist now actually connect back to things that go way before film. So science fiction literature predates science fiction film. And science fiction film borrows a lot of things from the novels that it's based on. Musicals are based very heavily on vaudeville theater, right? The same thing with melodramas. Melodramas are absolutely based on a certain kind of history of melodramatic theater, right? So if you look back further, a lot of the genres that developed in film already existed in literature, they existed in theater, they existed in different forms of media before film became a thing. Another thing to remember here is that film genres are culturally and historically specific. They are relevant to the social milieu in which they are produced. So film genres change over time. They evolve, they develop. They are specific depending on what culture you are in. Popular film genres in Japan in the 1960s look very different than popular film genres in current America, for example, right? They're culturally and historically specific. They are relevant to the culture that produces them. Our culture becomes obsessed with particular types of film at particular times in history. We know that the Western, for example, died off at a certain point in history, and people were more interested, for example, in science fiction films. And if you look historically, you can basically look at the start of space travel, right, as the beginning of science fiction and film becoming incredibly popular, because the social milieu changed from a focus on sort of the West and rugged individualism to exploring outer space, right? So film genres are culturally and historically specific. Film genres also develop based on the film technologies available. So musicals were not available as a film genre until sound became part of film making, right? So prior to 1925, 26, when you didn't have synchronous sound in film, a musical would have been impossible. On a technological level, you just wouldn't have been able to do it. But once you get sound in film, suddenly you get musicals, right? Musicals become incredibly popular as a way to show off what film sound can do, right? The same thing with, if you look at like the preponderance of superhero films and big budget action and science fiction films, and the rise of CGI and motion capture. We get a lot of superhero films in the 1990s, the 2000s, 2010s, 2020s, especially post 2000, sort of as a response to 9/11 and wanting to feel kind of control over our environments and control against kind of outward enemy forces, but also because we have the technology to start showing Spider-Man swinging from a web in a way that looks realistic and not really that cheesy anymore. You get CGI, you get better green screen, you get motion capture technologies, and suddenly this type of film is more possible than ever before. So this has to do with the changes in the world around us. It also has to do with the changes in technology that's available to us as well. Another thing to remember here is that film genres experience cycles of popularity, but very rarely do genres entirely disappear. A lot of times a genre will kind of lie dormant for a while. There will be very few films made in that particular genre or subgenre, but after a while, someone wants to kind of dig it back up and try it again. So even though Westerns are not incredibly common films anymore, compared to like if you kind of go back in time and look at films in the 1940s, 1950s, Westerns were far more prevalent. It doesn't mean those films aren't made anymore. People are still making Westerns. They're just few and far between. So genres experience cycles, right? They become popular, they become less popular, they cycle back into popularity. People kind of keep speculating about superhero films specifically going out of popularity. Well, have we reached of the bust, right? So we have the boom and the bust of superhero films. Have we reached the bust portion yet? Are people tired of watching the Marvel movies? I would say at this point in time, no. It doesn't look like people are tired of watching those movies. They still make billions of dollars. And even if we have a collective burnout, we don't want to watch superhero movies anymore as a society for whatever reason, those movies aren't going to go away entirely. People will keep making them. That's what a genre cycle is. It means that something gains popularity, loses popularity, but eventually it's going to come back. Genres are never really dead, right? They're like zombies in movies. They always kind of come back. So let's leave it at that for right now. In my next video, I'm going to talk about the use of genre, genre conventions, and genre iconography. So stay tuned for more.